The quiet man walks in. The courtroom was full of whispers that morning. People leaned close to one another, trying not to be heard, yet unable to stop themselves from speaking. The air smelled faintly of old wood and nervousness, and the sound of footsteps echoed like distant thunder. Everyone was waiting for him. They didn't really know him, not personally, but they thought they did. They thought he was just another man who got too lucky, too rich, and now thought he was untouchable. The judge, a man with sharp glasses and sharper eyes, sat on the bench looking bored. He glanced at his watch and tapped his fingers on the wood. In his mind, this would be a short hearing. An open and shut case. Then the doors opened. A quiet man stepped inside. Sundar Pichai walked without rushing, without smiling, without looking at the murmuring crowd around him. He wore a simple suit, dark gray, not too expensive, not too plain. His shoes were polished but scuffed at the edges, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked like someone you might see on the train every morning. Someone you wouldn't remember. Yet the room fell silent. He stopped just before the defendant's table and gently adjusted his glasses. Then he sat down. The judge allowed himself a small smirk. So this was the man everyone was talking about. The one who supposedly built an empire without stepping on people, without raising his voice, without making enemies. The judge didn't believe such men existed. He leaned forward and said, "Mr. Pichai, you understand why you're here?" Sundar looked up and his eyes were calm. "Yes, Your Honor." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd at his soft reply. They expected someone louder, more defensive. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then you also understand that your case looks unconvincing at best." "I understand what it looks like," Sundar said. Quietly, the judge leaned back. "Good. Then let's begin." The opposing lawyer rose to her feet. She was sharp and confident, dressed in a bright suit. She walked to the center of the room and turned to face Sundar. "Mr. Pichai," she began, her voice like a blade, "you stand accused of negligence, of failing to protect the people who trusted you, of turning away when they needed you most. Do you deny this?" There was a pause. Sundar adjusted his glasses again. "I do," he said. Still calm. The lawyer smiled, as if she'd been expecting that. "Of course you do," she said, and then she looked at the judge. "We have documents, Your Honor. Emails, reports, witness statements. They paint a very clear picture of a man who chose silence over responsibility." The judge nodded, uninterested. "Go on." And so the lawyer went on. For nearly an hour. She spoke about numbers and contracts, about missed meetings and unsigned forms. She painted Sundar as careless, as distant, as someone who thought himself too big to be bothered by ordinary people's problems. With every word, the judge's smirk grew a little wider. He glanced at Sundar now and then, expecting to see him sweat or squirm or raise his voice in anger. But Sundar did none of that. He just sat there, listening. When the lawyer finally finished, she turned to Sundar with a victorious smile. "Well, Mr. Pichai, what do you have to say for yourself?" Sundar stood up slowly. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He looked at the judge, then at the lawyer, then at the crowd. And then he began. "I would like to tell you a story," he said. The judge frowned. "A story? This is a court of law, Mr. Pichai, not a theater." "It is not just a story," Sundar replied softly. "It is my answer." The judge sighed but motioned for him to continue. Sundar took a deep breath. 10 years ago, he began. "I was sitting in a room much smaller than this. A boy came to me. He was scared. He had failed his exams, and his father told him here would never amount to anything. The boy sat across from me, and he asked, 'What do I do now?'" The lawyer rolled her eyes, but Sundar kept going. "I told him, you start where you are. You learn what you can. You help whoever you can." That boy went on to become an engineer. Last month, he built a bridge that saved a village during a flood. 2 years later, a woman came to me. She said her husband had left her, and she had nothing left but her little shop. She said she was afraid. I told her the same thing. Start where you are. Learn what you can. Help whoever you can. She did. Today, she owns 3 shops and employs 20 people. The judge narrowed his eyes. Mr. Pichai, what does this have to do with the charges against you? Sundar looked straight at him. Everything. Because every one of those people is in this room. Every one of them is here today. And they will tell you what kind of man I am? A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge leaned forward. Is that so? Yes, Sundar said. You have read documents and reports, but you have not heard their voices. The lawyer crossed her arms. Your Honor, these so-called stories are irrelevant to the facts. But the judge, for the first time that morning, seemed curious. On the contrary, he said slowly, I would like to hear them. One by one, people began to rise from the benches. The woe who had failed his exams. The woman with the shop. An old man who said Sundar had once repaired his roof without being asked. A young mother who said Sundar paid for her daughter's surgery when no one else would. Each one spoke of kindness, of quiet help given without expectation, of resilience and humility. And with every word, the lawyer's smile began to falter. The judge rubbed his chin. Interesting, he murmured. But just when it seemed Sundar's case was turning, the lawyer slammed her hands on the table. Your Honor, she said sharply, none of this changes the fact that he ignored official duties, that he failed to sign critical agreements, that people suffered because of his negligence. Sundar looked at her then, and for the first time all morning, his eyes flashed with something stronger than calm. May I show you something? He asked the judge. The judge nodded. Sundar reached into his bag and pulled out a single envelope. He handed it to the clerk, who gave it to the judge. Inside was a letter. The judge unfolded it and began to read. As his eyes moved across the page, his face changed. First confusion, then surprise, then something almost like shame. He looked at Sundar. Why didn't you present this earlier? Because I wanted you to hear them first, Sundar said quietly, nodding toward the crowd. To know that what matters isn't just what is written, but what is lived. The judge put the letter down, but before he could speak, the lawyer snatched it up and read it herself, and as she read, her hands began to tremble. This is impossible, she whispered. This proves... She stopped. The judge looked at her. Yes? But the lawyer couldn't finish. She sank back into her chair, silent. The judge turned back to Sundar. I will need time to review this properly, he said at last, but I will say you have given me much to think about. Sundar simply nodded and sat back down. The judge banged his gavel lightly. We will resume tomorrow morning. The courtroom erupted into whispers again. Some people looked confused. Others looked amazed. Even the lawyer seemed shaken. As the crowd began to leave, Sundar stayed seated, his hands folded on the table. The judge watched him for a moment longer before standing and leaving the bench. But just as Sundar was about to stand, a voice called out from the back of the room. You don't belong here? It said. Everyone turned. In the shadows near the door stood a man no one had noticed before. His face was hidden, but his voice was loud and cold. You think you've won, the man said, stepping forward. But you haven't even begun to understand what's coming. The judge froze at the door. The lawyer stiffened in her chair, and Sundar looked at the man without fear. And show me, he said softly. The man smiled, though it was not a kind smile. Oh, I will, he said. And then he turned and walked out, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Sundar stood at last, adjusted his glasses, and quietly followed the crowd out of the room. Outside, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. A storm was coming, and Sundar knew it. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, start where you are, learn what you can, help whoever you can. And then he opened his eyes and walked into the waiting storm, but he did not see the man from the shadows, standing on the courthouse steps, watching him go. And the man was smiling. Asterisk, the storm breaks outside the courthouse. The air had changed. The gray sky above was now heavy and close, pressing down on the city like a giant, unseen hand. People hurried past Sundar with their heads down, pulling their coats tighter as the first drops of rain began to fall. The wind picked up suddenly. tossing leaves and paper across the steps. Sundar stood still at the top of the stairs, his hand resting lightly on the rail, watching the man in the shadows disappear into the crowd. His eyes lingered on that figure until it was swallowed by the sea of umbrellas and blurred outlines. He could still feel the man's smile in the back of his mind, sharp, cold, like a blade pressed to his neck. The words the man had spoken echoed again in Sundar's memory. You haven't even begun to understand what's coming. He tightened his grip on the rail for a moment, feeling the cold metal under his fingers. His face remained calm, but deep inside him something began to stir. It was not fear exactly, nor anger. It was something heavier, something that felt like the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders all at once. He took a slow breath and straightened his back. When he finally descended the steps, people glanced at him in passing, but quickly looked away when they met his eyes. Some whispered. Some simply stared, caught between curiosity and one child even tugged at his mother's hand and pointed at Sundar before being quickly pulled along. He walked slowly, feeling the rain soak through his thin jacket. Every step on the wet pavement made a soft sound, a quiet rhythm that matched the steady beat of his heart. He did not rush. Even as lightning cracked far off above the skyline, even as thunder rolled through the streets like a warning, Sundar kept his pace. But then, at the corner of the street, he stopped. A man was waiting there, leaning against the lamppost with an umbrella tilted lazily over his shoulder. He wore a dark overcoat, and his shoes gleamed even in the rain. He watched Sundar with a faint smile. Not cruel, not kind, just curious. You're late, the man said softly when Sundar reached him. Sundar's eyes narrowed slightly. I wasn't aware I was expected. Oh, the man replied, chuckling under his breath. You've been expected for a long time. He pushed himself off the lamppost and started walking, motioning for Sundar to follow. Sundar hesitated, only for a second before falling into step beside him. The streets here were quieter, the shops shuttered, the lights dim. The man spoke again without looking at him. Do you know who he is? The one who spoke to you in court? I don't, Sundar admitted. The man nodded slowly. You will. And when you do, well, he glanced at Sundar, his eyes sharp as glass. Let's hope you're ready. And you? Sundar asked. Who are you? Me? The man said with a small shrug. I'm just someone who owes you a debt. Before Sundar could respond, the man stopped abruptly and pointed to a narrow door set between two darkened shops. Inside, he said, you'll find something waiting for you. Sundar studied the door. There was no sign, no number, just old paint peeling from the wood. Why should I? Sundar asked quietly. The man's smile deepened, but his eyes were serious. Because if you don't, he said, you won't make it through tomorrow. With that, he tipped his umbrella, turned, and vanished into the rain-soaked street. Sundar stood there a moment longer before reaching for the handle. It was cold and rough in his hand. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was dark at first, but then a single dim light flickered on above him. He found himself in a long, narrow hallway lined with old photographs, their glass frames dusty and cracked. Each photograph showed a face, but the faces were blurred, as though the images had been smeared by a careless hand. He walked slowly, feeling the boards creak under his feet, and the deeper he went, the colder the air became. At the end of the hallway, there was a table, and on the table, a single envelope, just like the one he had shown the judge that morning. He picked it up carefully and slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it were 6 words written in an unfamiliar hand. He knows more than you think. Sundar read it 3 times. Then, from somewhere behind him, a floorboard groaned. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. A faint laugh echoed through the darkness, low and mocking, and then silence. He folded the note carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and left the way he had come. Outside, the rain was falling harder now, the storm finally breaking open. He stood under the overhang of the doorway, staring into the rushing street. The world felt heavier somehow, the colors sharper, the wind colder. When he finally stepped, Back onto the sidewalk, he didn't notice the figure watching him from across the street, hidden under the shadow of an awning. But the figure noticed him and did not look away. Later that night, in his small apartment, Sundar sat at his kitchen table with the note in front of him. He didn't turn on any lights. The glow from the city outside spilled through the window, washing the room in a soft gray light. He remembered the judge's face when he read the first letter. The way the lawyer's hands had trembled. The way the man in the shadows had smiled. And now this second note, waiting silently on the table like a question he could not yet answer. He thought of the people who had spoken for him in court, the boy, the shopkeeper, the old man. He thought of all the years he had spent building something he believed in. And he wondered, was it enough? His phone buzzed suddenly on the table. He picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. Midnight. Rooftop of the courthouse. Come alone. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he stood, slipped the note into his jacket pocket, and walked to the door. Outside. The storm raged. The streets shone slick and black under the streetlights, water rushing along the gutters, wind rattling the signs. He walked quickly now, his coat clinging to him in the rain, his shoes splashing through the puddles. The courthouse loomed ahead, dark and silent, its windows glowing faintly from the inside. He slipped through the side door and climbed the narrow stairwell, his breath coming faster now, not from fear, but from the strange electric tension humming through the air. He reached the top and pushed open the heavy door to the roof. The wind hit him like a wall, cold and sharp. And he stepped out into the night. The city stretched out below, lights flickering in the storm. Lightning flashed above, throwing everything into harsh relief. And there, standing near the edge of the roof, was the man from the shadows. He didn't turn as Sundar approached. You came? The man said, his voice barely audible over the wind. You asked. Sundar replied. The man chuckled softly, still calm. Even now, admirable. Sundar stopped a few feet away. Why am I here? The man finally turned. His face was pale in the lightning, his eyes dark and full of something Sundar couldn't name. Because the man said, stepping closer, you've made enemies you don't even see yet. And unless you understand what you're up against, they will destroy everything you've built and everyone you've helped. Sundar met his gaze without flinching. Then tell me, he said. The man studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small black folder. He held it out. Read this, the man said, but not here. Not now, tomorrow, after the hearing. And remember, not everyone who smiles at you is a friend, and not everyone who fights you is your enemy. Sundar took the folder and tucked it under his arm. The man stepped back, his coat billowing in the wind. You think you know the game, the man said softly. But the real game hasn't even begun. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment, the man was gone, swallowed by the storm, leaving Sundar alone on the rooftop. He stood there for a long time, feeling the rain on his face, the folder heavy in his hands. Below him, the courthouse clock struck midnight, each chime echoing into the dark, and somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes were watching, waiting, and smiling. Asterisk, the real game begins morning. Came slowly, dragging its weight across the city like a tired animal. The storm from the night before had passed, but it left behind a sky that was dull and heavy, painted in shades of gray and silver. The streets were wet and glistening, reflecting the pale light in long streaks. Sundar stood at his window, looking down at the world below, holding the black folder in his hands. He hadn't slept, not even for a moment. Instead, he had sat at the little kitchen table all night, staring at the folder as though it might open itself and reveal what it carried inside. But he had not opened it yet. Not because of fear, though perhaps there was a little fear buried somewhere deep in him, but because he understood something now. Once he opened it, nothing would be the same. Not for him. Not for anyone who had stood with him in that courtroom. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each sound more insistent than the last. Finally, as though moved by some quiet decision inside him, Sundar slipped the folder into his jacket pocket and turned toward the door. The courthouse was already alive when he arrived. Reporters gathered on the steps, their cameras and microphones, like weapons glinting in the light. People crowded the sidewalk, some shouting questions, others craning their necks to get a better look. Sundar walked through them without a word. His calmness seemed to push them back, to create a quiet path just wide enough for him to pass through Dot inside. The air was warmer, but no less tense. The clerk at the entrance nodded to him with an odd sort of respect, though her eyes held a flicker of something else, maybe pity, maybe worry. Sundar acknowledged her with a slight nod and made his way to courtroom Dot as he stepped inside. He felt the silence press against him. The judge was already seated, his face stern but unreadable. The lawyer from the day before sat at her table, her hands folded tightly, her expression sharp but less certain than it had been Dot. And behind them, in the rows of benches, sat the people who had spoken for him, the boy, the shopkeeper, the old man. Their eyes followed him as he walked to his place, and in those eyes he saw something that surprised him. Trust. He sat down, placed his hands on the table in front of him, and finally he opened the black folder. The papers inside were thin but heavy with meaning. As he read, his brow furrowed, and his fingers tightened around the edges of the sheets. Each page was a quiet explosion of revelation. Contracts that were never supposed to see daylight. Emails that told a different story than the one presented in court. Signatures that did not belong to him but had been used in his name. His chest tightened, but not with panic, with understanding. He could almost hear the voice of the man from the rooftop. Not everyone who smiles at you is a friend. The judge cleared his throat, snapping Sundar out of his thoughts. Mr. Pichai, the judge said, "We are ready to proceed. Do you have anything to add before we continue?" Sundar stood slowly, holding the folder in his hands. He looked at the judge, then at the lawyer, then at the crowd behind him. "Yes," he said quietly. And then, in a voice that carried through the entire room, steady and clear, he added, "I have something you all need to see." He walked forward and placed the folder on the judge's bench. The judge frowned but opened it and began to read. With each page he turned, the frown deepened into something darker. By the time he reached the final page, his hand was trembling. Slightly Dot, the lawyer, stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp with alarm. "That folder has nothing to do with—" "Sit down," the judge interrupted. His voice low but cutting through the room like thunder. She froze. The judge looked back at Sundar. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Sundar asked gently. The judge closed the folder slowly, as though the weight of it had doubled in his hands. He turned to the clerk and whispered something that no one else could hear. The clerk nodded and left the room at once. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The lawyer sat down again, her face pale now, her hands no longer steady. And then, from the back of the room, a door opened. 2 men in dark suits entered, their badges catching the light. They moved with quiet authority, walking straight to the lawyer's table. "Ma'am," one of them said softly, "you need to come with us." The lawyer's eyes darted to Sundar, and for the first time he saw fear in them. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. The 2 men helped her to her feet and led her from the room. The judge leaned back in his chair, still holding the folder. He looked at Sundar for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "Mr. Pichai," he said quietly, "you may sit." Sundar returned to his seat, his hands folded once again on the table. The judge cleared his throat. "This hearing," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber, "will resume after I've reviewed this material in full. Court is adjourned for the day." He banged his gavel once and stood, disappearing through a side door. The people on the benches began to whisper again. But this time it was a different sound, not doubt, not accusation, but something closer. To awe Dot as the crowd filed out of the room, Sundar remained seated, staring at the empty bench where the judge had been Dot. Then, slowly, he rose and made his way to the exit Dot outside. The air was cooler now, the storm completely gone. Sunlight broke through the clouds in quiet beams, painting the wet streets with gold. But as Sundar stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt it again, that invisible weight of eyes on him. He stopped, letting the crowd move past him, and then he saw him, the man from the rooftop, standing at the corner, leaning casually against the lamppost, his coat collar turned up, his dark eyes fixed on Sundar. This time, Sundar walked straight toward him, when he reached him. The man smiled faintly. "Well, done," he murmured. "Who are you?" Sundar asked quietly. "Someone," the man replied, "who has been watching you for longer than you realize." He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and tilted his head, studying Sundar. "You did better than most. But this," he nodded, toward the courthouse behind them, "was only the beginning. The real game starts now." "Then tell me what I'm up against," Sundar said, his voice calm but edged with steel. The man's smile faded. He leaned closer, his breath warm against Sundar's ear. "You're up against everyone who smiles at you when you walk into a room," he whispered. "You're up against everyone who shakes your hand and says they believe in you. You're up against a machine so big you can't even see its edges yet. But you've already heard it, Mr. Pichai, and it does not forgive." He straightened again, his dark eyes glinting. "You'll hear from me soon." Then he stepped into the crowd and was gone, swallowed by the river of people, leaving Sundar standing alone. For a long moment, Sundar just stood there, staring at the spot where the man had been. The sounds of the city swirled around him, car horns, footsteps, voices, but they felt distant. Muted. He turned slowly and began walking down the street, his reflection following him in the puddles. The folder was gone now, and the judge's hands, but the words inside it were burned into his mind. The faces of the people who believed in him rose before his eyes. The boy, the shopkeeper, the old man. He thought of them. And he thought of the machine. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw another message from the same unknown number. "Tonight, Warehouse District. Come alone, or they will." He stared at the screen, feeling the weight of those words settle into his chest. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. The golden sunlight fading as evening crept closer, and somewhere in shadows, the machine began to stir. Asterisk, the machine reveals itself. Warehouse District lay at the edge of the city like a forgotten memory. Long rows of low buildings stretched into the dark, their walls stained by years of rain and soot. The streets here were silent except for the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional hiss of steam from vents hidden in the walls. Streetlights flickered uncertainly, casting weak pools of light that barely cut through the thick shadows. Sundar walked alone. His shoes made soft sounds against the cracked concrete, each step echoing faintly in the stillness. He carried nothing with him except the weight of what he already knew and the heavier weight of what he did not. He passed silent trucks parked along the street, their windows clouded and dark. The smell of oil and rust hung in the air, mixing with something faintly metallic, sharp enough to taste. He stopped at the address written in the message. It was just another warehouse, its windows boarded up, its door nothing more than a slab of old metal with scratches along the edge. There was no sign, no light, no sound from inside. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, listening to the quiet. Then, without hesitation, he reached out and pushed it open. The space inside was vast and dark, the kind of darkness that feels alive. High above, faint beams of moonlight cut through holes in the ceiling, falling like pale ribbons onto the concrete floor. The smell was stronger here, a mixture of dust, oil, and something unfamiliar, something electric. As his eyes adjusted, he saw shapes in the gloom, stacks of crates, long tables covered in sheets of paper and broken machinery, and rows of filing cabinets that stretched toward the far wall. And then movement. A figure stepped out from behind one of the crates. The same man from before. His dark coat blended with the shadows, but his eyes caught the faint light, sharp and steady. "You came?" the man said softly, his voice carrying easily in the silence. "You asked?" Sundar replied. The man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He motioned for Sundar to follow and turned, walking deeper into the warehouse. Sundar followed without a word, his steps measured, his senses alive to every creak and whisper of the place. They passed through a doorway at the back of the warehouse into another room, smaller but brighter. Here, long fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bathing everything in a cold, sterile glow. The room was filled with machines, rows and rows of them lined up like soldiers, computers, servers, tables snaking across the floor. Blinking lights that pulsed faintly like distant stars. The air was cooler here, and the hum of the machines created a low, steady rhythm that settled into his bones. "What is this?" Sundar asked quietly. The man stopped in the center of the room and turned to face him. "This," he said, spreading his hands slightly, "is what you're really fighting." He gestured toward the nearest machine, a towering black column of wires and screens. "We call it the machine," he continued. "But it isn't just one thing. It's a network. A system. It's in the banks. It's in the courts. It's in the companies you thought you built with your own hands. It's in the hands of people who never once showed their faces to you, but it has seen you. It has watched you every step of the way." Sundar looked around slowly, taking it all in. The machines, the screens, the endless rows of blinking lights. "Why?" he asked. The man's expression darkened. "Because you threatened it," he said, simply. "Because you refused to play the game their way. You helped people who weren't supposed to rise. You built something they couldn't control, and when they couldn't bend you..." He gestured toward the machines again. They decided to break you." Sundar let the words settle over him. Then he stepped closer to one of the machines, studying it. Its screen showed strings of numbers and words that moved too fast to follow. Its lights blinked in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. "Who runs it?" Sundar asked. The man shook his head. "Not one person," he said. "Not even one group. The machine runs itself now. But it answers to those who feed it, and they..." He trailed off, glancing toward the far wall where a cluster of cables disappeared into the shadows. "They are already moving against you." Sundar straightened slowly. His face was calm, but his hands curled slightly at his sides. "What do they want?" he asked. The man looked him in the eye. "Everything," he said. "And they don't care who they crush to get it." There was silence between them for a moment, broken only by the steady hum of the machines. Then the man stepped closer and lowered his voice. "They already planted people in your company," he said. "In your team, even in the courtroom. Every piece of paper you've seen, every accusation, every failure, it was all written here first." He tapped the nearest machine lightly. "You were never fighting just a mistake. You were fighting this." Sundar stared at the machine, feeling the weight of its presence in the room. "Can it be stopped?" he asked finally. The man's expression shifted then. Something hard and cold settled in his features. "Yes," he said. "But not by fighting it the way they want you to. Not by standing in courtrooms and waving papers. Not by playing their game. You have to go to the heart of it. And you have to be willing to lose everything." Sundar's jaw tightened slightly. "Where's the heart?" he asked. The man hesitated, just for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered notebook. He handed it to Sundar. "In here," he said softly. "But once you open it, you can't go back. You'll see things you can't unsee. You'll know things that will make you question everyone around you." Sundar took the notebook, feeling the rough texture of its cover under his fingertips. The man stepped back, watching him closely. "You've already proven you're stronger than they thought," he said quietly. "But strength won't be enough for what's coming." Sundar opened the notebook slowly. Inside, the first page was filled with names, dozens of them, written in neat, precise handwriting. Some he recognized, some he didn't. On the second page was a map. A series of lines and symbols that made little sense at first glance. But in the center, circled in red, was a single word. Origin. He closed the notebook and looked up at the man. But the man was gone. Sundar was alone, now in the room full of machines. Their hum seemed louder somehow, their blinking lights sharper. He stood there for a long moment, holding the notebook, staring at the word burned into his mind. Origin. Then. From somewhere deep in the shadows of the warehouse, a new sound rose. Voice cold, mechanical, and yet unmistakably human, spoke from the darkness. We see you. Sundar Pichai. It said. He froze, turning slowly toward the sound. The machines around him began to flicker, their screens flashing words and numbers. Faster now, almost frantic. The voice spoke again, louder this time, filling the room. You have been weighed. You have been measured, and you have been found inconvenient. The lights above him flickered, and then everything went dark. Sundar stood still, listening to the silence that followed, feeling the weight of the notebook in his hands, feeling the eyes, unseen but unmistakable, watching him from the darkness. And he knew then, without doubt, that the real battle had only just begun. Asterisk, the heart of the Machudas city seemed different. Now, as Sundar walked through its streets the next day, he noticed things he had never noticed before, or perhaps he had never allowed himself to see them. Cameras on every corner, silent and watching. Small black cars parked just out of sight, their windows dark. People on their phones, speaking in low voices, glancing up at him and then quickly away. The machine wasn't just inside the warehouse. It was here too, hidden in plain sight. He could feel it now, humming beneath the surface of everything. He carried the battered notebook close to his chest as he walked. The word origin still echoed in his mind like a quiet drumbeat. It had kept him awake all night, his eyes tracing the map again and again under the dim light of his kitchen. The lines had begun to make sense after hours of study, and now he was following them, each street and alley a step closer to whatever lay at the center of this invisible storm. His journey led him to the outskirts of the city. Here the buildings grew sparse and broken, their windows shattered, their bricks stained black by decades of neglect. The air was thicker here, heavy with dust and something that smelled faintly metallic. The streets were empty now, and even the birds had fallen silent. He found the place at the end of a long, cracked road. It was a door like any other, plain, gray, with no sign above it. But Sundar knew at once this was it, the heart. The origin. He stood in front of it for a long moment, feeling the quiet weight of the notebook in his hand. Then he reached for the handle and pushed. The door swung open with a low groan, and a rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it a faint sound, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to come from somewhere deep below. He stepped inside. The corridor beyond was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with pipes that hissed softly as he passed. His footsteps echoed, each one swallowed quickly by the steady pulse that grew louder the farther he walked. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying a faint scent of oil and electricity. At the end of the corridor, he found a staircase that spiraled downward. He descended slowly, one step at a time, his hand trailing lightly along the metal rail. The sound of the machine grew louder now, no longer just a heartbeat, but something deeper, a constant murmur that felt alive, almost like breathing. At last he reached the bottom. The space here was vast, a cavern carved out of stone and steel. Massive cables hung from the ceiling like black vines. Rows upon rows of screens lined the walls, each one filled with streams of numbers, names, and faces that changed faster than his eyes could follow. The air was thick with heat and static, and the floor vibrated faintly beneath his feet. And in the center of it all, the heart. It rose from the ground like a dark monolith, taller than any man, its surface alive with faint lights that moved like veins beneath the metal. It was silent, and yet somehow louder than anything he had ever heard. Standing before it, Sundar felt both very small and very heavy, as though its presence alone pressed him to the ground. He stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Then a voice, not from the machine, but from the shadows, spoke. Behind him. You've come farther than I thought you would, the man from the rooftop murmured, stepping into the light. Sundar turned, meeting his gaze. You knew it would end here, Sundar said softly. The man nodded, his face more serious now than Sundar had ever seen it. Everyone ends here, he said. Some don't even know what you're looking for when they arrive. But you knew. Sundar looked back at the heart. What is it? The man walked closer to the machine, his eyes never leaving it. It is every lie, he said quietly. Every broken promise. Every choice made out of fear instead of courage. It is every name erased from the books because someone decided they didn't matter. It is everything we gave away, piece by piece, until nothing was left but this. He placed his hand lightly on the metal surface, and for a moment it seemed to respond, a faint shimmer of light running out from where his fingers touched. But it's also something else, he added. Sundar waited. It is what happens, the man said, when no one says no. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Then the man turned to Sundar, his expression hard now. You can still walk away, he said. You can still go back to your life, pretend none of this exists, and let someone else carry the weight. Or, he paused, his gaze steady. You can try to break it. Sundar stood silent for a long time, the hum of the machine surrounding him filling his chest. And if I fail? He asked, finally got the man's lips curved into something almost like a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. Then at least you will have tried, he said. Sundar looked at the notebook in his hands, then at the machine towering before him. He thought of the boy who had come to him years ago, frightened and lost. He thought of the woman who had rebuilt her life because he believed in her. He thought of the old man whose roof he had fixed with his own hands. He thought of every face that had stood in the courtroom for him, and every unseen face this machine had already erased. He took a step forward. Then, the man stepped back into the shadows, his voice soft but clear. Remember, he said, it will fight you. It will use everything it knows about you. It will show you things you don't want to see. It will even try to make you believe it's already won. Sundar stopped, just inches from the machine, his hand hovering over its surface. But, the man added, if you stay standing long enough, if you endure, it will show you the truth. Sundar's fingers touched the cold metal dot. The machine shuddered, and a sudden sharp light burst outward, blinding him when he opened his eyes. Everything had changed. The cavern was gone. He was standing in a vast, endless space, a kind of dark sky filled with countless glowing threads stretching in all directions. The ground beneath him felt solid but shifted faintly with each step. As though alive, the machine's voice rose all around him. No longer human, no longer mechanical, but something deeper. You wanted to see me, it said. Sundar turned. Slowly, his eyes scanning the vastness. I wanted to understand you. He replied, you already do? The voice whispered. Suddenly the threads around him shifted, forming shapes, memories from his own life. The boy sitting across from him years ago. The woman holding her shop keys for the first time. The old man smiling as his roof was mended. But then the shapes grew darker, the courtroom full of whispers. The lawyer's cruel smile. The judge's disappointed eyes. The man in the shadows always watching. You think you are better than me, the voice said. Its tone colder now. No, Sundar answered simply. Just different. The threads tightened, wrapping around him, pulling, and his arms and chest